Today's case will make you angry at the police who could have prevented a murder of a 15-year-old girl. If the police would have listened to parents of previous victims, they could have stopped an unlikely serial killer in the making. When Cecil Thornton from Martinez, Georgia heard frantic banging on his front door on the night of February 10, 1989, the last person he expected to see was 17-year-old Shari Teets. That's because Shari was all over the news because she had been kidnapped 4 days prior. Crying and bruised, she told the men she just escaped the closet of nuclear design engineer Richard Starrett. As the investigation unfolded, a horrifying truth emerged. Shari was lucky to be alive because Richard murdered the last girl he kidnapped. Hey guys, just a quick note. We didn't realize until after we recorded that we said the killer's name incorrectly. It's actually Richard Starrett and not Starrett. The sinister double life of Richard Starrett. 2 days earlier, on February 8, 1988, Shari from Irmo, South Carolina called her father Dale at work and told him that a man called and said that he was interested in the waterbed. The family put it up for sale through a classified ad, and Dale was happy to get rid of it. He told his daughter to call him when the buyer got there, and since he worked less than a mile from his home, it will only take a few minutes to get there. But Dale never received the call, so he just assumed that the buyer probably lost interest or he got lost since Dale's trailer was in the middle of nowhere. But when he got home at 5:30 in the evening and the door was unlocked, a sense of dread immediately set in. The inside of the house appeared normal, and Shari's car was still in the driveway, but she was nowhere to be found. What the Teets family didn't know was that their daughter was taken by a stranger. Her kidnapper? It was the man who wanted to see the waterbed, 29-year-old Richard Starrett. With his everyday looks and neat appearance, Shari thought he seemed nice enough and let him inside while she went to call her dad. But before Shari could reach the phone, Richard pulled out a gun. He told her that if she tried anything, he would kill her. Reluctantly, she complied. Richard covered her head with a blanket, then quickly walked her outside to his car. He then forced her to lie down on the car's floor and drove the teenager across state lines. Once they reached his home, she was handcuffed and kept locked in chains in his closet. For 4 days, a terrified and abused Shari was intimately violated. Even though she was terrified, she was able to keep her cool and waited for a chance to make a break for it. Shari finally got her chance on the 4th day of her captivity. Richard had drunk himself into a stupor, and when he put her in the closet for the night, he neglected to chain her back up and didn't lock the door. As soon as she thought he was asleep, Shari decided that it was now or never. She was able to sneak past Richard, made her way into the living room, then crept out of the front door. With fear in her every step, she bolted to the house across the street. By the early hours of February 12, 4 a.m., the police were alerted and her parents were called. The relief that the Teets family must have felt is immeasurable. It's an outcome that tragically many parents of missing children never experience. The police placed the family in protective custody for 2 days while they searched for the kidnapper. By the time the police made it to Richard's house, he was already gone. That launched a nationwide manhunt for the engineer. For 4 days, 100 officers from 6 different agencies went on the hunt for Richard. His bright red Chevy Camaro was spotted all over Georgia, like some sort of automotive boogeyman, but the cops were always a step behind. On February 14, 1989, a Texas state trooper was doing a routine license plate check at an interstate rest stop when he spotted Richard sleeping with a gun between his legs. He didn't fight the arrest and was extradited back to Georgia. Investigators thought they were going to have a fight on their hands to get any information out of Richard, but instead, he left the investigators baffled. Because he not only admitted to Shari's kidnapping, he eagerly confessed to crimes they didn't even know about. And what developed was a disturbing portrait of a man living a double life that not even his wife knew about. Who is Richard Starrett? When reporters and investigators talked to the people that knew Richard Starrett, the one thing everyone said that he was quiet and reserved. The information that was being uncovered about Richard just didn't make sense. He gave to charity and was involved in local politics. Despite his reputation, what he did to Shari just didn't reconcile with the Richard everyone knew. That is until you looked into his early life. Richard Daniel Starrett was born on September 25, 1959, to a Mormon family in Georgia and was the third of 4 children. His mother owned a salon and his father worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. And from all accounts, His parents were loving and his family was pretty normal. The only thing that wasn't normal was the amount of head injuries that Richard suffered. It all started right from birth. When he was born, forceps had to be used. Forceps were used when there was a difficulty in the birthing process and the baby had to be adjusted. Unfortunately, their use caused severe bruising around Richard's head. Then, when he was about 2 or 3, he fell out of a moving car and bumped his head on the street. Instead of rushing him to the hospital, his dad just brought him home and put him to bed. When he was around 5 or 6, he took a 9-foot fall from a slide, landing headfirst on asphalt. That time, his parents did take him to the hospital, and the doctor said that he had a concussion but was otherwise okay. At the age of 7 in 1967, Richard started experiencing sudden falls. One time, he collapsed in a mall, and his father, mistaking it for a bit for attention, yelled at him to stop. It was only after a severe headache that led to another fall that his father recognized the gravity of the situation and sought medical help. After extensive testing, doctors discovered that he had one leg that was shorter than the other, but it didn't explain his frequent falls and debilitating headaches. Around the same time, there were noticeable changes in his behavior, and he began obsessively drawing depictions of girls trapped in various objects. 7-year-old Richard was also fixated on order and cleanliness. His mother recalled that he never needed to be disciplined because he was his own toughest critic. Anything out of place would cause a tantrum, and he showered 5 times a day. His teachers told his parents that he was hyperactive at school, but they reassured them that he was advanced for his age and his behavior was because he was bored with classwork. We'd like to make a note that according to the National Institute of Health, studies show a correlation between traumatic brain injury, TBI, and increased aggression or violent behavior. This risk also might be higher for younger individuals at the time of injury. However, the NIH doesn't fully confirm that TBI causes violence. While it cannot be confirmed that Richard's multiple head injuries caused him to be violent, it was noted by his mother that his behavior changed after his last major fall. As Richard grew older, his urge for taking risks grew. He loved climbing trees and jumping from them. By the time he was 10, his family moved to Panama. It was during this time he explored an abandoned house and found a treasure trove of adult magazines. This newfound fascination with girls soon spiraled into an all-consuming obsession that carried over into adulthood. While he was in college in 1981, Richard compulsively stalked and followed random women home, and he never stopped being a daredevil, and he became a self-proclaimed adrenaline junkie. In college, he once hung half his body out of a car window as someone drove over 70 miles per hour, and he even joined the skydiving club. To everyone that knew him, he was the good guy, likable and charming, but behind his good guy persona, no one could have guessed the dark thoughts he kept hidden. Richard went to college in Georgia, then transferred to a school in California. At 28, he met and married his college sweetheart, 23-year-old Michelle Ward, in 1983. And for a while, the couple lived a happy married life. By 1987, the Starretts moved back to Martinez, Georgia, and Richard was hired as a design engineer at the Savannah River nuclear plant in South Carolina, which was about 30 minutes from his home. Michelle hated living so far from her family, so the couple came up with an unusual solution. Richard would allow Michelle to fly to California to visit her family. These trips lasted between 6 to 8 weeks at a time, and with him insisting that she become a stay-at-home wife, she was free to do so. 1987 was also the year that Michelle gave birth to their daughter, and their relationship dramatically changed. The caring and affectionate Richard was gone, and it was replaced by a man that wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole. And on the rare occasion that he was in the mood, he wanted to do acts that we cannot describe on YouTube. So it's no surprise that Michelle took these long vacations as a break from Richard's attitude towards her. The attacks begin. In December 1987, Michelle took their daughter to visit her family in California. What she didn't know was that Richard was waiting for that exact moment to live out his depraved fantasies. His plan was simple. He was going to shop for potential victims through classified ads from South Carolina. He targeted ads selling heavy furniture, and when he called, he always asked if someone would be there to help move it. If a girl or woman answered the phone and told them to call back later, he assumed that they were alone and would just show up. If his gamble paid off, he'd make his move. On December 31st, 1987, he arrived in Richland County, South Carolina to pick up a couch that was advertised in the Carolina Trader. He knocked on the door and a 12-year-old girl answered. Will referred to her as Girl A. Richard asked if Girl A's parents were home and she told him no, and that's when he forced her back into her house and intimately violated her. After the terrible deed had been done, he simply drove back home to Georgia with no one knowing what he did. For 6 months after the attack, Richard lived his normal life. He went to work and even had time to help out with a local politician's campaign. But this was just a disguise to prevent anyone from suspecting him of his true nature. He forbade his wife Michelle from entering his office when he wasn't there. And in that room was a closet that she wasn't allowed to even touch the doorknob. He had gotten so paranoid about it that he ended up padlocking the door. On June 24, 1988, Richard struck again. While his wife was out of town, he answered an ad in the Carolina Trader. Like his first attack, the victim was a 12-year-old girl from Irmo, South Carolina. We'll be referring to her as Girl B. With Girl B, he decided to escalate. Once he confirmed that she was home alone, he snatched her and forced her into his car. He drove her across state lines to his home in Georgia, where he violated her. Even though he never made an attempt to cover his face, Richard had placed all of the family photos face down so Girl B couldn't see them. Once he was done with his disgusting act, he drove her back to South Carolina and dropped Girl B off a few streets away from her home. Richard's next attack was only 6 days later. This time, he brought a video camera with him. When the 22-year-old seller asked him about it, he said that he just purchased it and didn't want to leave it in the car. She didn't suspect a thing and invited him to inspect the furniture. And that's when Richard pounced. The 22-year-old was tied up, intimately violated, and he videotaped the entire horrific ordeal. Once he was finished, he dragged her into a closet, laid her face down, and left her there. For a stretch of 5 months, Richard kept a low profile and kept to his regular routine since his wife was home. But his casual disregard for his wife grew into full-blown neglect, putting further strain on their marriage. Tired of Richard's behavior, Michelle decided that she was going to spend the Christmas holiday with her family in California. That decision angered Richard, and the pair argued over Michelle staying home instead of going to California because he wanted to spend time with her and their daughter. He even went so far as to buy a plane ticket to California. However, he had a dark change of heart and abandoned the idea of reuniting with his family. Instead, he decided to hunt. The disappearance of Jeannie McCrae. On December 21, 1988, 15-year-old Jeannie McCrae from Irmo, South Carolina heard a knock on her door. It was a man that called earlier about picking up some furniture he saw in the Carolina Trader. Her family lived in the upscale Coldstream neighborhood, and as she let him inside, he grabbed her and told her not to struggle. She managed to convince him to let her leave a note for her family, and once she was done, he forced her to wear taped-over sunglasses and made her get into the car and drove away. By 3 p.m., the McCrae's housekeeper came in for her shift and discovered that the back door was wide open. Worried, she called out for Jean, but there wasn't an answer. A pit in her stomach grew as she searched the house for the 15-year-old. When she opened Jeannie's bedroom door, nothing was out of the ordinary, except for one thing. Lying on Jeannie's bed was a note that read, "Dear Mom and Dad, I'll be gone for a few days, Jean." The housekeeper immediately contacted Jeannie's parents, and when they got home, alarm bells went off. Jeannie never signed her name Jean. Her parents called the police to report their daughter missing. With no signs of struggle, the only thing missing was Jeannie. The police originally decided that Jeannie was just another runaway, but her parents were adamant that she would never do such a thing. Jeannie was more or less a homebody, and her home life was good. There weren't any arguments, and she hadn't been in any sort of trouble that would give her a reason to run away. The investigators spoke to her friends, and they said the same thing. Neighbors called her a happy-go-lucky and well-mannered girl. During the first days of her disappearance, her family passed out flyers and put missing person notices in daily newspapers, but it was like she vanished into thin air. Jeannie's Christmas presents went unopened that year. As Jeannie's family searched for her, the Lexington County Police hands were tied. Per their policy, if there was no evidence of a crime, there wasn't anything to investigate, and so her case was treated like any other missing persons case. It wasn't until 6 weeks later when Shari Teets went missing that Irmo Police Department finally began taking notice of Jeannie's case. Unlike the police response to Jeannie's disappearance, the police went full force looking for Shari. The day after she went missing, a helicopter searched the area and the sheriff called agents from the South Carolina Enforcement Division, or SLED for short, to help with the case. It must have been a bittersweet moment for the McCraes that Jeannie's case was finally getting attention. A determined father and police failure. While everyone was trying to figure out what was happening, it was actually the father of Richard's 1988 12-year-old victim, Girl B, that put two and two together. After his daughter was attacked, Girl B's dad never believed that his daughter was the only victim targeted through the classified ads. He repeatedly urged the Irmo Police Department to look through their case files for similar attacks. Determined to find his daughter's attacker, Girl B's dad began tracking assault arrests in Lexington and Richland counties. After learning about a recent attack, Girl B's dad called Richland police to see if the cases were similar. The cases weren't related, but what the investigators didn't know was that there was a very similar attack the year before involving Girl A. With the lackluster response from the police, some people might have given up, but Girl B's dad wasn't going to let it go. In July 1988, he contacted SLED and managed to convince them to create a flyer asking for information about assaults through classified ads and to send them to the local police departments. The flyers were printed but were never mailed out. SLED could never explain why they weren't sent. By the time Jeannie was kidnapped in December, there were 3 attacks with the same MO. As the Lexington County Police investigated, they initially didn't make any connections between the assaults and the classified ads. Around mid-January 1989, an officer from SLED finally noticed the pattern, but it wasn't until Shari Teets' kidnapping that SLED finally sent out the flyers that Girl B's dad requested a year before to all of the South Carolina police departments. After Shari was kidnapped, Sheriff Metz decided to keep the connection a secret from the public, but the South Carolina newspaper, The State, found out about the flyer and wanted to release that information to the public. This caused tension with Irmo's police sheriff Metz. The editor-in-chief believed that the people had a right to know about an active threat, but the sheriff disagreed and said that there was a crime prevention program that was already in effect. And even after the newspaper The State made the public aware of the connection between classified ads and several kidnappings and assaults, Sheriff Metz was intent on being vague. He said the whole Carolina trader connection was just one lead among many that they were investigating and that there were no clear connection between abductions. This wasn't the first time Sheriff Metz dismissed the connection between 2 kidnapping cases. He had a similar stance for the 1985 murder case involving 2 girls, Sherry Smith and Deborah Helmick. The kidnappings led to one of the largest search efforts South Carolina had up to that point. Initially, he maintained that there was no evidence to link the 2 crimes. However, as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that both girls fell victim to the same serial killer, Larry Bell. And with all the back and forth between the media and the police, the McCrae still desperately needed the answer to what happened to Jeannie. The final days of Jeannie McCrae. What Jeannie's family and the police didn't know was that Jeannie was only 30 minutes away. For the first few days of her captivity, Jeannie was locked in a closet and chained, only being let out when Richard wanted to violate her. At some point, Jeannie was able to convince Richard that he didn't have to keep her locked up and that she'd be good. And so, he began letting her out of the closet without handcuffs and gave her mostly free rein throughout the house. He kept her there for weeks while his wife was still in California with their daughter. But nearing the 1-month mark in January 1989, he shot and killed her. While he has been consistent in telling the story of how he kidnapped Jeannie, he has given 2 different stories about what happened the day of the murder over the years. The first story is that one night he took his pistol out of a drawer when Jeannie suddenly lunged for it and tried to snatch it out of his hand. During the struggle, the gun went off and Jeannie was shot and killed. The second story paints a quote-unquote picture of domestic bliss. Richard told the police that during Jeannie's captivity, they acted as though they were a couple. They played games and watched TV and allegedly even took a trip together. He said one day after the pair returned from an outing, they decided to take a shower together and he shot her. The reason? It was because he claimed that he was falling in love with her. Richard then wrapped the body in a green blanket and plastic bags, drove to the woods and dumped her body there. Richard's dirty secret. After getting away with Jeannie's murder, Richard likely thought he can do it again. That's why he kidnapped Shari a month later. And just like Jeannie, Shari was able to convince Richard to give her more freedom inside of his home. However, given that his wife was set to return in February, it was more than likely that Richard would have come to the conclusion of getting rid of Shari faster than he did Jeannie. The truly insidious thing was that Richard Starrett was your everyday average guy. About a week before he kidnapped Jeannie, he was out shopping with his mom to buy presents for a local battered women and children shelter. He was the sort of guy that insisted on walking his daughter's 14-year-old babysitter home because he wanted to make sure she was safe. He never made any attempt towards her. Richard was the last person you would expect to be a monster. When Richard was caught, he confessed to the attacks, the murder, and virtually everything connected to them. He also led police to Jeannie's body. He told them about his storage unit, something he hid from his wife for 3 years, and police weren't prepared for its contents. The storage unit held 935 adult books and magazines that depicted women in painful and extreme bondage positions, as well as various devices that he planned to use on his victims. He also told the police that he threw away all of the videotapes of his crimes in a dumpster near Birmingham, Alabama when he was on the run. There are other materials that were so graphic that we can't describe on YouTube. When the police searched his home, they found Richard's forbidden room. Inside the closet were dozens of books of criminology, books about kidnappings, and dozens of books and article cutouts about Ted Bundy. There were also videotapes of some of his victims. The closet had multiple chains and shackles attached to the ceiling. If Shari had never escaped, Richard's kill count could have been just as staggering as his idol. The trial. Richard faced charges in South Carolina and Georgia. In South Carolina, he was charged with the kidnappings of Jeannie McCrae, Shari Teets, and Girl B, and the assault of Girl A. In Georgia, he faced charges of murder, child molestation, sodomy, and false imprisonment. He also became the suspect of dozens of other crimes in California and North Carolina. Some of those cases also involved women being attacked after posting classified ads. But there wasn't any evidence to connect him to the other crimes. Even before his first trial, there was drama. His wife, Michelle, divorced him to the anger of his mother, who believed that Michelle should stand by her man. And Richard tried to end himself a week before the trial by locking himself in the bathroom, breaking a mirror, and using the glass on himself. That delayed the trial by a month, but it couldn't delay it forever. Though it wasn't for a lack of trying. 2 weeks before his trial in September 1989, he went on a hunger strike as self-imposed penance for what he had done. On September 15, 1989, Richard Starrett tearfully pleaded guilty but mentally ill in front of a judge in South Carolina. In order to get a more lenient sentence, his defense portrayed him as a man helplessly caught in the grip of bizarre sexual fantasies so compelling that he couldn't resist them. His lawyer said that he was living a nightmare, but the court didn't buy it, and he was ultimately given 5 life sentences for the kidnappings and plus 20 years for the assault. His second trial was in Georgia in May 1992. Unlike in South Carolina, he had a competency trial to find out if he was insane or not. But after multiple date changes, it doesn't appear that it ever took place. Richard pled guilty to the charges and acknowledged his crimes against 7 women and girls. Unfortunately for Richard, his lawyer wasn't able to sway the judge for a lesser sentence, and he was given his 6th life sentence and sent back to a South Carolina prison. But the story doesn't end there. In 2006, Richard and another inmate tried to escape prison. He and the other prisoner were spotted walking between the inner and the outer gate of the prison, but they were immediately caught as they tried to make a break for the outer gate. As of the making of this video, Richard Starrett is still serving his 6 life sentences. Thank you for watching The Twin Files. It's crazy how easy it was for Richard to attack these girls and not be suspected. If you're interested in another unlikely killer that hid in plain sight, watch our video about Tomi Yano, a Japanese salesman that killed the college student and got away with it.